This is the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. Andy Payton is the lead pastor at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. Randy Moore is associate pastor at Methodist Temple. Their goal is to see Christ in everything and everyone.
Welcome in, friends. I am Randy of the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. I'm associate pastor here at Methodist Temple United Methodist Church in Evansville, Indiana. As always, I'm joined by the lead pastor here at Methodist Temple, Pastor Andy Payton, and always look forward to this time, Andy, to sit down and just spend some time with you and spend some time with our friends.
It's always a gift to have a conversation, and this is what it is, right? Like, it's just a conversation that we have. It just happens to be recorded, and then we share it with other people. And so,
right.
I was just saying before the podcast began how I like it that it's authentic, right? I mean, because we're just sitting here okay, let's talk about this sermon that happened.
Nothing's really rehearsed other than the fact that you've preached a sermon that we're going to reflect on. But in terms of rehearsal, there's no rehearsal. Yeah. Hey, it occurred to both of us that we started this podcast, however many weeks ago it was, beginning with kind of a soul check-in, going back to John Wesley. We would say, how is it with your soul? As you've noted, it's more appropriate to say, how does your soul prosper? And we just came out of a staff meeting at church, and you closed it with an impromptu devotional at the end because there was the official devotional at the beginning, and you spoke about soul. I'm going to ask you to sort of recap that a little bit. I think some others could benefit from that.
Okay. So, I mean, that's the question, right? In the Methodist tradition, we've asked that question since the beginning. How is it with our soul, or how does our soul prosper? And as any person looks inward, they'll find that their soul sometimes is happy or sad, or we can be glad or anxious or fearful. Now, here's the thing I've noticed. My soul is off whenever I've forgotten about the first love. In some ways, I think that's what our soul does for us. It reminds us when we've forgotten about the first love. And what's the first love? Well, that's the love of God, of course, the love that God has for us. Before we did anything at all, God loved us. At this moment, God's love is sustaining us, and God's love will be there when it's all over. And so when we ask that question, how is it with our soul? That's something I've started to learn to do with myself, is a lot of the times when I'm off, it's because I've forgotten about the first love. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's just about that simple, really. I know it's like, oh, yeah, God loves me. No. Like, yeah, really. I mean, God really loves you and me. And it's that love that makes us, it sustains us. And it's the original blessing, if you will.
I've had to remind myself of that many times. I've spoken about this the last couple of podcasts, but I'm still nursing an injury. I broke my ankle, and I've been in a splint for 6 weeks, almost 7 weeks now, and it affects your quality of life. I mean, to a great degree. And I was just reading yesterday. I try to avoid referring to Dr. Google a lot, but for whatever reason, I was just looking at some things the other day, and it was talking about the fact that you have to sort of beware of even depression coming on.
Sure.
And I've sort of noticed that. And that has helped me to come back to that first love as well, because you always have that, no matter what else is going on. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that is. The other thing I wanted to bring up, which I think is an important distinction about our soul, is that for the ancient Hebrews, there wasn't any soul and body separation. Soul really meant all of who you are.
Your inner self as a whole.
Yeah. The whole thing.
Mind, emotions, spirit, it's all of that. It's
Yes.
the condition of your entire self, right?
Yeah.
It's just we're not talking about something that may or may not exist after we die, although we do believe in life eternal, don't get us wrong. But
right.
When we say, how is it with your soul? We're saying, hey, how are you internally? How are you? That's the question.
Yeah. And before we started the recording here today, we were talking about some Hebrew words, and I think the word for, this is another one, I think it's nephesh. Isn't it nephesh? Soul? Nephesh? And it's like breath, that thing that, or life force, that thing that gives us life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, in the Greek, this thing's going off the rails.
Yeah.
Now we're going Greek. It's the soul. I think soul is psyche in Greek, where we get the English word psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a helpful way to think about it, really. Is like, we talk about our mental health today. We talk about our well-being. In many ways, that's kind of what we're asking.
Right.
Our well-being is off when we forget that we're part of this greater love. We get out of tune.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good way to open it up. I'm glad we've gotten back to that. It's a good practice. We are, though, in the midst of your sermon series on the Beatitudes right now. Not just the Beatitudes, you're on the windows here, the stained glass windows at Methodist Temple. And we're deep into it. We're already into verse 7 from the 5th chapter of Matthew. And I think I'll just read these again, because you can take these individually, but I think they were meant to be taken together. Mm-hmm. And so let me just read this. This is the first thing Jesus says as he goes to the mountain for what's known as the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 5, verses 1 through 12. It says this. It says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And here's this week's beatitude. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I'm going to interject this because it came up in my study this week, and maybe you're going to talk about it in one of your sermons as we move along. But there is more material given to persecution in Matthew and in Luke's version on the Sermon on the Plain about persecution. And it even here seems set outside of the first 10 verses, because the first 10 verses are bracketed by kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, in verse 3. And in verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then there's this extra material and more material about persecution common to both Matthew and Luke.
What does that tell you?
Yeah. It tells me that it's important. It tells me that especially during the time, not only during the time that Mark was written, not only speaking to Mark's audience, we know that because it was written around 70, the same time that Jerusalem was defeated and the temple was destroyed. But certainly persecution hadn't ended for Matthew's community, so persecution was something that they dealt with. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's conflict for sure. I mean, you see echoes of it in Matthew's gospel. I think it's the only gospel that uses the word church, ecclesia, and the funny thing about that is the verse that talks about church also talks about conflict, which tells us that there's conflict in the community.
No.
I know, shocker. You telling me that the church always kind of had some conflict? Yeah, basically the movement has always had some conflict. It's what it means to be alive, right? Like there's going to be conflict.
Anywhere 2 or 3 people gather in my name, there I am, and there's also going to be some conflict.
Yeah, and there's going to be a debate about something.
Yeah.
So. Yep.
Okay, so blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Before we jump into that, you want to just do kind of a quick take on the sermon series itself and where we've been to this point.
Okay, so you want me to go through the Beatitudes that I've done?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The way I interpreted that, applied that, was like you're in a fortunate place when you've hit that moment in which you say finally, okay, I'm ready for a change. I'm ready for something to become different. You're poor in spirit, you're open. Blessed are they who mourn, they'll be comforted. So mourning is the price we pay for change. Mourning is the price we pay for transition. So if poor in spirit teaches us you're ready for a change, mourning's going to be what has to happen in order to make that change take place. In the sermon on mourning, I talked about the difference between change and transition. Change is an external event in which something becomes different, but transition's the internal transformation that often takes time after a change has taken place. And so we talked a little bit about what does it mean to mourn well. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The meek are really those that have been, I guess internally, they've dedicated themselves to the right sort of goal. They're striving for the right sort of thing, which leads into the next one. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. What is the right thing we seek and we strive for? We seek and we strive for righteousness. We seek and we strive for the gift of God's presence. That's what it means to be filled. And then this week we're up to, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy.
Yeah, and so this is a sermon series about the stained glass windows here at Methodist Temple, and you started off this sermon last Sunday describing the window that depicts blessed are the merciful.
Mm-hmm. Each window is its own little sermon, and this week was no different. The top of the window at Methodist Temple, if you were in the sanctuary right now looking at the window, at the very top of that window, you'll see a sword pointed down. But the interesting thing about the sword is the end of it's cut off, and that teaches us a little bit what it means to be merciful. And there's a disarming quality to the practice of mercy. As you look down at the bottom of the window, you will see there's a group of really disciples, and their hands there are open. You know, they're not closed. They don't have fists. They don't look like they're going to hit anybody, anything like that. They're just open. And for me, that teaches us a little more about mercy. There's a vulnerability to the practice of mercy. And then as you look at the middle of our stained glass window, there's like a big bowl, really. And it reminds us that there's a certain amount of receptivity that mercy requires. But then the thing that always, sticks out for me is there's a bee. It's a bee buzzing in the middle of the window. And you're like, well, wait a minute. What's that about? Well, that's there as a reminder, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we're to be busy like a bee, pollinating the world with mercy. And so it's just a really great depiction of this beatitude.
All right. So how about a definition of merciful? Because a lot of times we do connect it to forgiveness.
Yeah. So biblically speaking, mercy, especially as Jesus talked about mercy, is not just about adopting a merciful type of attitude or a forgiving type of attitude, but the mercy Jesus, if you really think about the way Jesus lived his life, especially, we see it, but the mercy that Jesus was asking us to embody here is like, I care about someone else so deeply that I'm willing to act upon it. That's the practice of mercy. I'm willing to put myself in their shoes and think what they're thinking, feel what they're feeling, and see the world through their eyes. And that practice of mercy calls forth a response. How can we not respond when we're able to put ourselves in another person's shoes? And the Hebrew word that mercy is likely attached to is a word called tesed. I got this from William Barclay, who's
classic
commentator, taught at the University of Glasgow during his life. I think he died in 1978, but he was a really just great biblical scholar, New Testament scholar. But he points out that the Hebrew word for mercy is tesed, and that's what tesed is. It's like, I'm willing to put myself in another person's shoes and then respond accordingly. And certainly we see that kind of mercy being embodied by Jesus and his followers throughout the Gospels.
Yeah, the action is so important. It's getting inside of the other person, relating to the other person, understanding the other, but then taking some kind of action. And I'm going to throw this into, because I'm in the middle of doing a study on the Gospel of Mark. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus doesn't say a whole lot, but Jesus acts a lot. And this is going to go down another path that we're not going to really have time to do today, but there is the idea of the messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus is constantly telling people, hey, I'm going to heal you, that's fine, but just don't tell anybody about it. Mm-hmm. And part of that, and scholars have tried to figure out what in the world is he talking about, but part of that is, it's not so much what I say, it's what I do. Mm-hmm. It's what I'm going to be doing.
Right.
there's a connection there too.
Well, if you want to know what a person believes, just watch what they do.
Yeah.
You can say what you want. You can post what you want online.
Right.
But what do you really believe is what you do in the end. Such a challenging thought because especially as preachers, right? I mean, how many practice what you preach, preacher, and it's hard.
Especially since it's mainly words. We're about words.
Oh, and we're all about words. And we're going through the Beatitudes. And you're like, holy moly, yeah. So
you used other biblical examples.
Yeah, in Matthew's gospel, there's actually a couple other places where the word mercy is used. And in my sermon, I kind of broke that down because they are great illustrations of this idea of the practice of mercy. And the first time beyond the Beatitudes, so the Beatitude, of course, is Matthew chapter 5, but the first time we find the word mercy appearing again is in Matthew chapter 9. And it's a famous story. I mean, most people who've been going to church for a while, I'm sure have heard this story. It's the calling of Matthew the tax collector. And story goes, Jesus is walking along one day, and then he encounters, we'll hear some people in the background there. Yeah. Again, this is an authentic podcast.
Yes.
We're having a conversation.
Life goes on.
Yes. And so Jesus is walking along, though, and he comes upon Matthew, the tax collector. And it's important to understand context here. Tax collectors, they were not well liked in the first century context. I mean, in fact, they were ridiculed and just hated because they often took advantage of their position and they charged people more money than they should in terms of the taxes they paid. And so here comes Jesus, and he invites Matthew the tax collector to come follow him, and people are shocked. They're just shocked. And then Jesus, in typical Jesus fashion, takes it a step further. He goes out to eat with them. And he sits down with Matthew the tax collector, all his tax collecting friends. And at that moment, the religious elite begin to criticize Jesus, like, who do you think you are? You're going to sit down with these people. And then Jesus responds and he says, hey, it's not the healthy who need the physician, it's the sick. And then he says, go and learn what this means. God basically desires mercy and not sacrifice. And so essentially, what do we get from that in terms of the practice of mercy? Well, at a bottom line type of basic level, what we see Jesus doing here is saying human need is more important than cultural or religious expectations. That God desires that sort of mercy, that sort of compassion, that sort of sensitivity to others. That's the first one. The second time that mercy, again, I guess it would be the third time mercy appears, I guess the second time beyond the Beatitude it appears, is in Matthew 12. Again, Jesus and the disciples are walking along, and this time they're in a field. It's the Sabbath. And there's a lot of rules, of course, in the ancient Jewish world, in the context of that time, in which you did this, you don't do that on the Sabbath, especially you don't work on the Sabbath, and they had all these different rules and expectations of what that meant and looked like. In any case, one of the things a person couldn't do was pick grain and work on the Sabbath. And so just understand that as Jesus and the disciples are walking along in a field, it's the Sabbath, they get hungry, they begin to pick food and start to eat. Again, the same group of people, the religious elite, begin to criticize Jesus and his followers. Say, who do you think you are? You're breaking this rule. We don't do this. And again, Jesus responds, you need to learn what this means, that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. And it's kind of like that same point all over again, right? It's that what's more important to Jesus, the ritual, if you will, that Jesus practices is human need is more important than cultural religious expectation. This is what it means to be a follower of Christ. Yeah.
Mercy, not sacrifice.
Yeah. And it's not that the sacrifice, of course, is attached to the Jewish temple sacrificial system. I think that's probably what it's talking about. It's not that wasn't important to Jesus. It's clear Jesus made the trip to Jerusalem and participated in the Jewish religion at the time and all those kinds of things. Absolutely. But this is more important. If you miss this one, then the rest of it's kind of, what are you doing? Right. And so towards the end of the Gospel of Matthew, then you really get a pretty specific list of just real kind of pragmatic ways to practice this type of mercy. In fact, in the Christian tradition, in Matthew chapter 25, we call these our works of mercy. And so in the Methodist Wesleyan tradition, we have works of what we call piety and works of mercy. Works of piety are ways that we open ourselves to the gift of God's presence. This is things like we pray, we read the Bible, we attend worship services. These are works of piety. Well, works of mercy are those practices that characterize Christian love that we're called to. No, we're not held to the religious and cultural standards of the world around us as Christians, but yes, we are held to this challenge of embodying this type of spirit in the world. And in Matthew 25, we get this famous verse from Jesus. Really, he just lays it out. He says, hey, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. And when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And then you gave me clothes to wear. When I was a stranger, you visited me. When I was in prison, you came to see me. And then in Catholic tradition, they add actually one more, and I'm not sure how to frame this in light of the verse. When I was dead, you buried me, maybe, I don't know. But in the Catholic tradition, they add one more to this list of 6, and it's bury the dead. And so this is what it looks like, according to Jesus, to practice mercy. This is what it looks like even to this day if you take the Christian tradition seriously to practice mercy. And so you're basically a person that responds to the needs of other people. That's it.
Yeah, and because you brought up that they added, burying the dead, you had a really interesting story about your own father's funeral.
Yeah. And just as an illustration, in my sermon, about a year ago, coming up on a year really, my dad died from cancer. And the day of the wake, everyone's probably been to a funeral that's listened to this podcast before. On the day of the wake, though, my family and I were standing there in front of the sanctuary, and people are walking through. And my dad's wake was in Mooresville, Indiana. I live in Evansville, Indiana. That's a 2.5-hour drive. The thing I remember is the people who from Evansville made the trip and walked through and shook my hand. And it was it was a moment of grace, humbling. And I said on a number of different occasions to these folks, Randy, you're one of these people that walked through. I remember. You didn't have to drive all the way up here. And they're like, well, yeah, we did. Yeah. And
it's more than paying respects. To your point, it is assisting in the burying
of the dead. You're loving a person by being there for them. Yes. I like it that the Catholic tradition added that because a lot of times, in our culture today, we avoid death at all cost. We're so uncomfortable with mortality. And I guess as pastors, Randy, you and I we're forced to face it all the time, right? Like even this week, I'm going to be participating in another funeral this week. And we are reminded all the time, but in our culture, we run from that idea of mortality. We run from that. We hide from it. And in this list of practices, though, it says, no, you confront it. When someone else has experienced a loss in their life, you go there. You be there for them. That's Christian love. That's what it means, to use a term, that's what it means to be a witness of Jesus Christ. We bear witness to his love by practicing that love in our life. We are actual witnesses then. Talk about it all you want. Right? You can talk about it and you can say this and that about Jesus and got to believe this or do that. But it's in the end of the day, how is it being practiced in our lives?
Yeah. In my Sunday school class, we talked about this. You and I as pastors are at more funerals than most people other than funeral home directors. And because I have some age on me, I'm at more funerals. I work with people who are perpetually 25 years old, right? So I keep getting older, but the people I'm around at work, they're always, in their mid-20s. And the thought occurred to me that they might not have been to very many funerals. Mm-hmm. Their grandparents, I'm sure some of them have passed, but by and large, their grandparents are even still alive. And when it comes out that I've been to a funeral or I'm going to a funeral, the response is always kind of one of real sadness, like, oh, I bet that's terrible, and that's awful, and I'm like, well, in a sense, it is. Someone has died.
It's sad.
But it is sad. But in another way, it's just it's burying the dead. It's a necessity, it's a necessity that we take the time with it and that we do it right and that we don't rush through it. And it's actually something that gives me, I'm trying to find the right word for it, but
there's a fulfillment in it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the best term to use, but I mean, as a pastor, stepping into that moment, there's such purpose.
Yeah.
My being here is important. And then when people walk through, there's purpose in that. Their being there is, no, you're not happy. You're not like, it's not warm and fluffy.
Right.
But there's kind of this, and the word happiness kind of plays into this a little bit, like deep happiness, purposeful happiness. Like, my life's important here. I'm giving expression to something important here for this person. It's about them. It's not about me. It's about them. Mm-hmm. This person's lost somebody. And you step into it as a person of faith that believes in this type of love. You step into it,
Mm-hmm. And everyone, whether they have a church home or not, during those times, they do reach out, and even they, in those moments, realize that this is an important process. Grief is an important process. It's a process that has to happen. It's not anything that can be chosen. It's just going to happen. It's how you go through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's inevitable. I mean, as far as I can tell, none of us get out of here alive.
Right.
And so it's going to touch each and every. It's a uniting, common experience for every single person. We all are every last one of us are going to lose someone, and at the end of the day, we're going to lose our own life.
Yeah.
And the quicker we figure that out and admit it, really the better off we are.
That's when you start living.
You start living. You're not wasting yourself on this stuff that just don't matter in the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that was a story that touched me, and that's probably why we spent so much time on it here in the podcast. But you also shared a story about walking over to the University of Evansville.
Yeah. So back to the feeding the hungry, clothing people, drink when they're thirsty, that kind of stuff that Jesus says in Matthew 25. And the thing is, in the city of Evansville, for example, a person doesn't have to go 2 blocks to find someone that is hungry and is in need. At the church here at Methodist Temple, the other day, I didn't even get out of the parking lot. A person had stopped me and said, "Mister, can you help me? I need something to eat." And I pointed him to our blessing box, and we have a blessing box at the church, and it's located just on Main Road, Lincoln Avenue. People can go there and get anything they need. It's open to anyone, and we just replenish it every week through the gifts of our congregation. But that basic response to need there is always there if we're open to it. The other real challenging one is about the clothing, though. And the Christian tradition, I'm trying to think of the saint who says it. I think it's maybe like Ambrose or someone like that. But in any case, there's a saint that said, if you open your closet, that's a spiritual practice, because as you look in, you might see that there's 2 shirts. One of those belongs to you. You can only wear one at a time, and the other one belongs to someone else.
Right.
And I mean, in our consumer culture today in the Western world, that's such a screaming challenge to us, right? We have all these shoes and clothes and shirts and just everywhere. And the Christians from the past would look at that and say, well, you've got a great opportunity to help a lot of people right there. You should give that away, And but there's fulfillment in that, doing that too as well. So, yeah. And of course, this is all opposite. If you think about back up to our culture, we've been talking a little bit about culture today, I guess, but it's the opposite of our culture today. What's the greatest challenge to practicing mercy in the way Jesus describes it? Why is it we cannot think the thoughts of others or feel the feelings of others or see the world through their eyes? And the reality is it's because we're too busy thinking our own thoughts and feeling our own feelings and worried about our own selves that we don't.
And airing grievances?
Yeah. And that's it's a very effective way of describing the culture of our time. Frank Bruni is a New York Times columnist, and he just wrote a book called The Age of Grievance. He says that's what we're living in, an age of grievance, where we're so focused on ourselves, we don't see the needs of other people. And he basically laid out that there's four really simple questions that we are constantly asking. And that is, how have we been wronged? What do we feel like is owed to us? Who has wronged us? And how are we going to get our revenge? And if you look at leadership in our society right now, doesn't matter what your political persuasion is, really. That's essentially what we're doing, though, is we're airing our grievances publicly. Through that airing of grievances, we're bringing people together. And I'd say, how's that working for us? I mean, we're not happy. We're not blessed, as the Beatitude claims. We don't feel like we're in a fortunate place. In fact, it's the opposite, right? We're looking over our shoulder. We're infected with suspicion. We're not interested in the needs of other people. And just to put it real simply, though, the gospel is not about grievance. It's about grace. And that basic idea is what should motivate us as a people of faith.
I'm glad you brought up Easter in your sermon because you've been in the sermon series and we haven't been following those Sundays in Easter. I'm glad you brought it up because it was the last Sunday in Easter and you said something that stuck with me, and that is that God, we see this in Easter, we see this in the resurrection, that God reverses the worst the world has to offer.
Yeah. That's the good news of Easter. And we don't even think about it as Christians, right? But we wear this thing called a cross, a lot of us. We're getting ready to update our website at the church, and we've been doing some new logos for the church lately. And our symbol's the cross, and it's the Christian symbol. But if you stop and think about what does that cross really represent, it's a taunt to the forces of evil and darkness and criticism and grievance and all those things. It's a taunt to that culture and that voice. And it says, you're not the most powerful force in the universe. You're not it. I believe in a God. We believe in a God as a Christian people that takes the worst and then overcomes it. That God's love is the most important. God's love is the most powerful force in this universe. And to really believe in that, you say to yourself, okay, and now I'm going to be a channel of it. I'm going to witness to it. Practice this idea of mercy now in my life. And that's Easter, right? I couldn't not talk about that.
Right.
So, yeah.
It's appropriate all the time.
It's the message.
Yeah.
It's the centerpiece. You go in a worship setting and there's a cross. You know it's a church because it's got a cross on it. And we wear it and we don't think about it. What does that mean?
Well, we should say something about Mother's Day, even though it's past. Mother's Day is a church phenomenon. It's not a religious holiday, but it is a big day in the church.
It's like Easter all over again, really, in a lot of congregations.
Right.
Yeah. And our attendance is way up here at the church. We've done different things on Mother's Day to celebrate moms. I mean, there have been times where every mom gets like a flower or some sort of like little ornament type of thing or something. But one of the things we've done in the last couple of years is rather than give a gift to the people who show up, we try to give a gift back to our community in honor of a mother's love. And so this year we gave $10 per person that showed up in person for worship or checked in online with us, and we gave a gift to our Methodist Temple Children's Center. And the reason why we did that is because one of the things we believe is one of the greatest challenges in terms of missions in our world today is adequate childcare, and so we want to support that. And I'm really excited to say we are writing a check to the Children's Center for $4,660. So we had 466 people participate in that, and it's such a hopeful thing.
Very good. That really is, and such an important ministry. And the news came out just this week that since, I forget the date, it might have been 2019, the cost of childcare is up 30%. And so
30%.
30%. And so, wow. I mean, that's a ministry, right? It absolutely needs to be a ministry.
I was talking to a community leader not long ago, and I said, what's the greatest challenge facing our community today? And it was interesting. You can always see a person who's trying to just come up with something or someone who really has something on their heart. And this person, without even skipping a beat, you could tell it was on their heart. They said childcare. Yeah. Andy, it affects everybody. Think about it. No, it doesn't matter what your socioeconomic place in this world is. Childcare is going to affect you. It's going to affect our economy. It's going to affect families. It adequate child care even affects education. That gives a kid a foundation. They're learning from the very beginning. A great child care center is going to give a kid that foundation to continue to grow as they even go on to kindergarten and school. And so, I'm proud that we have a daycare here, and I hope we can continue to grow it. And I know you can't help but to grow it because so many people need it.
Right. And it's been a groundbreaking one, not to pat ourselves on the back there, but I learned this by doing a funeral from somebody who was instrumental in getting things going here. And it was, I think, one of the first daycare centers to take infants in Evansville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of that's true for most cities. A lot of the daycares started in churches.
Mm-hmm. Like a lot of the hospitals did. And again, I'll go back to this theme for the day. They were expressions of this idea of mercy. We hear what's happening in the world around us enough to respond to the needs of others. This is the practice. And this is one that's going to continue to be a big need in our community and a big ministry of the church here for sure. Yeah. Well, let's wrap it up with a preview of Sunday's sermon. We'll be moving on through the Beatitudes, coming to verse 8 then, there in chapter 5 of Matthew. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Hey, before we get there, do you think there's anything here, maybe there's not, but blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. So is that the only beatitude where this condition is also the reward?
I don't know.
There might not be anything. Yeah. I just noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll have to give that some thought, Randy.
Okay. Then let's go to pure in heart, for they will see God.
So there's been a lot written about this particular beatitude. In the Methodist tradition, the way we've talked about it is not as much pure in heart, but what does it mean to be perfected in love is the way we've really framed it in our tradition. And what I'm going to talk about this weekend is really what this is about is figuring out what God's purpose for our life is and living into it. We're pure in heart. We've been perfected in love. I kind of like that one better a little bit. When we know we have fulfilled what the purpose is for God putting us here. And I think that's something we all long for and search for. Meaning is a big deal. Mm-hmm. It's not just enough to do something. I want to know what the meaning is behind it. Why? Why am I here? What am I for? These kinds of things. And so this, in my opinion, this beatitude hits on that.
Yeah. Made me think about our definition of soul and sort of coming to a better understanding and a better definition. And heart is a word that needs to be redefined or appreciated with another definition too.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we see the heart as that being the center of emotions, but it's much more than that.
Right.
Much more than that. Like soul is all of who we are. Heart carries some of the same connotations, I think.
It really does. And your soul is filled. Your heart is filled. I mean, even though you might be suffering for something, you can still be filled because you see how it's important. You see how it fits into a bigger picture. That's what we really need as humans to thrive. It's not that everything's just going to go our way. We're going to get everything we want out of life. And, that's what makes us happy. It's really more about what's my purpose here? What's my why? Understanding that and then leaning into that and to the point, and maybe even to the point, like being willing to suffer for it. That's where, spiritual happiness really is found.
All right. Very good. We will look forward then to this Sunday's sermon and our worship here at Methodist Temple. And we'll look forward to next week. And we thank you so much for listening. We really do appreciate your attention. And we kind of try to do it for you. And so thank you for listening. And we'll see you again next week.
This has been the Pastor Podcast with Randy and Andy. You are welcome to join us at Methodist Temple in person or online. Methodist Temple is at 2109 Lincoln Avenue in Evansville, Indiana. Our traditional Sunday morning worship service is at 8:30 with our contemporary service at 11. Log on to our website at methodisttemple.church. We see Christ in you.